We'll continue our overview of the Beis Hamikdash, and we're up to the Kodesh Kadashim. We don't have much here about the Kodesh Kadashim. He tells you that is an area that's 20 amma by 20 amma, not a very large area, the Kodesh Kadashim. However, it's 40 amma in height. So the ceiling is 40 amma above the ground. And no one went in there the whole year round, unless they had to fix it, except for the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim, and he went into the Kodesh Kadashim for two purposes. Number one, to be maktir the Ketores, and number two, there was a combination of two damim. That's the dam par and the dam sa'ir. And he mixed them together, and he did hazah in the Kodesh Kadashim in a place called Bein Abadim, which maybe we'll discuss a little bit later on. And the ultimate goal of this hazah was a double kapara. Number one, for himself and the Kohanim, and number two, for all of Klal Yisrael. So that was the special hazah that was done in the Kodesh Kadashim one day out of the year on Yom Kippur. Next, the Aron HaBris. Now, in order to understand exactly where in the Kodesh Kadashim the Aron with the Luchos HaEdus was located, we have to introduce something called the Even Shesiyah. So the Even Shesiyah was located in the middle of the width of the Kodesh Kadashim, and the Even was below ground, but it rose 3 etzbos above ground, a very short, a very narrow area. I mean, in other words, it's not above the ground, just 3 etzbos. And the Aron HaBris was placed on top of the Even Shesiyah. Now, in the first bias, there was Luchos HaEdus, and they were housed or hosted in the Aron. However, by the time of Yoshiyahu HaMelech, they already had placed the Luchos HaEdus in Gniza. There was no Luach HaEdus. And now we get into the whole issue. During Bayis Sheni, was there an Aron? Meaning, is the Aron what we call a Kli unto itself? Or is it merely a function of, it's a means to an end to house the luchos? If there are no luchos, if the edus is gone, then the aron has no status as an aron. That's actually a machlokes that even in the Rishonim they argue about this. What was the status of the aron during Bayis Sheni? So again, as far as Bayis Rishon is concerned, the aron is called the aron ha'edus because the luchos habris, which Moshe Rabbeinu received at Har Sinai, were housed in the Aron. Now, you know that there's a mitzvah that we read about yesterday, actually, in the Torah, about the badim. Those are the poles that were placed in many different kelim, but certainly in the Aron, on both sides of the Aron, and that's how you would lift the Aron and carry it. And the Torah says, lo yasu, that those badim have to be permanently attached to the Aron. They cannot be moved. Now, why is it important to mention the badim? Because since we said that there was only one occasion during the entire year when the Kohen Gadol entered into the Kodesh Kadashim, the two avodos that he did therein, one was the Ketores. That's not relevant to our discussion, but what's relevant to our discussion is the hazah of the two damim, the dam apar and dam asar, that were mixed together in one Mizbe'ach. And that hazah was done in a place called Bein Habadim, which is that part of the Aron located between the two poles. So that's what he says over here. Hoyamaze midam hapor midam asor ben shnei abadim. And that's a major sugya in our Masechta Yoma, exactly how he did these hazos bein abadim. And he says, by Sheni, Hare Nignaz, the Aron was already Begniza, Bimei Yoshio Amelech. And where would the Hazah be done? Because again, on Yom Kippurim, when the first Mikdash stood, it was a clear demarcation as to where the Hazah would be done, because there was an Aron and there would Badei HaAron. But in the second bias, where would they do the Hazah? And the answer is, the Makom would be demarcated by the Even Shasiyah. That was the Simon for the Makom of the Aron. So although the Aron wasn't available, nevertheless, the Even Shasiyah was there. And that's where the Aron was kept. He writes here, Kenegda Yakoin Gadol, Maza Midama Parvadam Asoyer. Kenegda means right in front of the Even Shasiyah, which is where the Aron was. And he writes that Mishnei Tzidei HaAron, Hayushnei Badei HaAron, Vayaruchim, Achayu Boltim in Aparoches, Klape HaHeichal. So in other words, when you walk into the Kodesh Kadashim from the east, you're passing through the Heichal, and there's a Paroches that separates the Heichal from the Kodesh Kadashim. And now what you're looking at in front of you, as you move towards the west, deeper and deeper into the Mikdash, are these Badei HaAron. And the Badei HaAron now are, in a sense, piercing through the Parochas. That can't be. So the Gemara says it was a great miracle. I can't explain this miracle to you, but somehow, even though the Badim were long enough to go to protrude through the Parochas, they didn't do so. That was some sort of miraculous event that took place during Bayis Rishon. And midas orkom haisa magas livlot biparochas, and their length would really pierce through the parochas if it was al derech hateva, but that didn't happen because of this miracle. Then he gives you some other calculations. We'll mention them in passing. I want to get to the next. The Tzadi Gimel is he says that between the Kotzel of the Azara and the Ulam, you remember that the Azara led into the Ulam, which was an area that was very, very long, if you recall, not too wide, but long. And the area between the wall around the Azara and the outer wall of the Azara, of the Ulam, was 17 and a half amma. And from the coastal of the Azara to the Mesiva and the Beis Horodas Hamayim, which we discussed last week, and that's on the northern side, which means turning towards the right of the Azara, it was 32.5 amma. And the same is true on the southern side, which means turning towards your left as you enter into the Azara, and that's again the same exact area of 32 and a half amma. Now, Rabbosai, we begin a whole new aspect, a whole new dimension of the Beis Hamikdash, and that is the Mizbe'ach HaChitzoni, the outer Mizbe'ach, which stood in the Heichal. Which stood in the Azara. And we'll see that there are four parts to the Mizbe'ach, going from the ground level all the way to the top of the Mizbe'ach. And we'll see that this Mizbe'ach served for almost all the Karbanos. This was the main Mizbe'ach. And this you'll see, he starts actually a new pagination here. So it's page 1, page Aleph. He says that on the Mizbe'ach HaChitzoni, they did most of the Karbanos, the Avodas HaKarbanos, and the Matan Domim of most of the Karbanos were done there. And on top of this Mizbe'ach, where they had the Maracha, that's where they burnt most of the Murim of the Karbanos. Now, there are many kelim in the Beis HaMikdash, but he says that the Kedusha, the sanctity of the Mizbe'ach, is the highest level of sanctity of any of the kelim. Now, I'm not sure exactly, he's quoting the Ritva in Sukkah. And the Sugi in Sukkah deals with, if you want to change one thing from a low level of Kedusha, you could raise its level of Kedusha, but not the other way around. So it could be that if some of the stones of the Mizbe'ach or some of the copper of the Mizbe'ach wants to be reused and earmarked for some other keli, we're not allowed to do that. That would be Morid in the Kedusha, because the level of Kedusha of the Mizbe'ach is the highest level. I'd be curious to know, and he's not going into detail here. For this, we'd have to learn Masechta Yoma. What would be the status of the Aron that housed the Luchos Habris? And you get the impression that the Beis HaMikdash, it's almost its essence is the Aron. Again, you can ask me obviously about Bayesheni, but that's called Geniza. We have to know more about what Geniza means. Could be that his comment here from the Ritva, that's what you have to research, is only referring to the Azara, not to the Heichal. So of all the Kalim that you'll find in the Azara, and there are many of them, the top of the list is the Mizbe'ach. As far as the Heichal is concerned, that's a whole different discussion. Now, what are the four essential parts of the Mizbe'ach? Number one, going from the bottom to the top, is the Yesod, which was on three sides, if you remember. Then you have the Kevesh, and we'll see a whole discussion where the Kevesh is actually part of the Mizbe'ach or not. Now the Mizbe'ach requires Ribua. It's got to be perfectly square, and it requires Chronos. A Chronos means, of course, the angles, but that's already you've guaranteed because it's a perfect square. And then we go up to the Gag of the Mizbe'ach, and there were four Chronos. These are the essential elements in the Mizbe'ach. Now, I'd like to call your attention to the concept of Ribua, because the Gemara is very fascinating in Masechta Menachos, compares Ribua in Tefillin to Ribua in the Mizbe'ach. Very interesting. Because let's say, for example, and this happens very frequently in Tefillin, you'll see that sometimes it gets rubbed out. Maybe it fell or whatever it is, and it's not perfectly square. And the question is, what is square? What do we call Ribua in Tefillin? And we're going to derive certain conclusions from Mizbe'ach. Well, let's say, for example, just to give you food for thought, the outer parts of your tefillin are perfectly square, but there's certain parts that aren't square. Between the four corners, you may have parts that aren't square. So I remember, when I was in Reb Soloveitchik's class, at that time, there was a whole scandal about what we call tefillin machers that were using glue. And the question was, since the glue is possible, does that mean it undermines the ribua? And we actually brought a pair of such tefillin to Rav Soloveitchik after a class. I remember he was trying to remember the sugyas about Mizbe'ach. What's considered ribua Mizbe'ach? You have a perfectly square. The four corners are perfectly square, but somewhere in between, it's pogum. It's not completely square. All right. Now, he says here, Chelkei HaMizbe'ach, Arba Chalokim Hayu Legova HaMizbe'ach, Sholosh Ribuyim Hayu Bo. So again, we're going from the bottom floor up, and we're going to identify four areas of the Mizbe'ach. 3 out of 4 of them have to be perfectly square. The first, of course, is the Yesod, which is the platform, so to speak, of the Mizbe'ach. And above that, we have that's called a sovev, which was that one amma that surrounded the Mizbe'ach and gave the Kohanim the ability to walk around the lower part of the Mizbe'ach. And then we get up to the Gag HaMizbe'ach. The Gag HaMizbe'ach is called the Makom HaMaracha, right? That's where the Haktaras Eimurim took place. The Tapuach, that whole area where they brought logs and they used it as fuel to burn the Eimurim. And that also requires Ribua. So the Makom HaMaracha requires Ribua. And that's called the Gag HaMizbe'ach. So we can use two terms that are synonymous. One is called the Makom HaMaracha, and the other is called Gag HaMizbe'ach. They're both the same. The Od may all of the Arba Pinots of Hayu Akronos. Now, on top of the Gag HaMizbe'ach, above the roof, on four corners, there were Kronos, the Kronos HaMizbe'ach, and they were necessary for certain matan domim. And the impression you get is that the requirement of Ribua applies not only to the Yisod, to the Sovev, to the Gag HaMizbe'ach, but also to the Kronos that are on top of the Gag HaMizbe'ach. Now, he says here that you should take a look at the diagram. So he has a diagram here. Okay. I'm not sure which diagram he's referring to. There are three on the page. Just one second. No, he doesn't specify. I would say it's the third diagram. I think that's the one he's referring to because there you see the square. The square on the bottom, and then the next square, and then you get to the top of the Mizbe'ach, which is square, and the Kronos. He says there are three different names. They're all the same for that Mizbe'ach. Number one, it's called Mizbe'ach HaChitzon, in contrast to the Heichal, which has its own Mizbe'ach HaPnimi or Mizbe'ach HaZav. So number one, it's called the Mizbe'ach HaChitzon. Number two, it's called the Mizbach HaOlah. Now, why do we single out the Olah? So this is based on a pasuk in Chumash. Well, actually, I'm sorry, it's pasuk in Tanakh. And the pasuk in Tanakh actually calls this Mizbe'ach a Mizbach HaOlah. Now, it seems that this title of the Mizbe'ach, which is in Tanakh, has a certain advantage because the psukim in Tanakh are describing the Mizbe'ach of the Beis HaMikdash. And the third name is only a name that we find in the Tanakh referring to the Mishkan. In Chumash, it refers to the Mishkan. That's called the Mizbach HaNechoshes. Because in the Mishkan, the Mizbe'ach was not only made of stone, but it was plated with copper on the outside. And therefore, the Torah uses the term Mizbach HaNechoshes. We picked up on that term, but really, technically, that term in its original context only refers to the Mishkan, not to the Beis HaMikdash. He says that the Mizbe'ach Shem Mishkan Nikra Mizbach HaAdama. So there's a fourth name to the Mizbe'ach, and that's called the Mizbach HaAdama. That's also a biblical name that refers specifically to the Mizbe'ach in the Mishkan. Now, in the next section, he analyzes where exactly was the Mizbe'ach located. Obviously, it was in the Azara, but where in the Azara? So we'll just begin this, we'll touch on this, and then hopefully we'll get into this more tomorrow. He says, there's a very specific place very perfectly designated. Ein mishano so mimakomo li olam, and the Mizbe'ach has to retain that makom, that location, for all times. Shenemar, then Mizbe'ach ha'olah li Yisrael. And again, a pasuk in Tanakh in Divrei Hayomim, and the Gemara derives from this pasuk that the Mizbe'ach has to be kavua, it has to be designated and never change from its place. He says, "Umesoros biyad hakol sha'makom shebana bo David u'Shlomo HaMizbeach the Goren Arona who ha'makom shebana bo Avram HaMizbeach the Akad Olavis Yitzchak who ha'makom shebana bo Noach sheyotza min hateva who HaMizbeach shehikra ol Kayin veHevel ubo hikriv Adam Arishon Karbon Kishen Nivra." So that makom, which David apparently specified when he purchased the land from Goren Arona, that makom has a long, long history that dates back to the time of Adam Arishon. Adam Arishon was makriv karbonos on the very day that he was born. The Rambam goes a step further and he says, "Umisham nivra ha'adam," that man was created from the earth upon which the Mizbe'ach stood, meaning stood later on in chronologically. We have Adam Arishon, we have Cain and Hevel, we've got Noach, and we've got Avram, and the Akedah of Yitzchak. All these took place on that specific makom, that location, that very, very meticulous, precise makom, which is the makom of Mizbe'ach. I mean, in the light of the history of that makom, you understand why we want to be so careful to make sure that Mizbe'ach is there, because we're really, in a sense, duplicating and perhaps even extending the avoda and the status of the Mizbe'ach of old, the original Mizbe'achos. Okay. Now, again, we didn't get into specifics about where exactly the Mizbe'ach is located, but that B'li Neder will pick up mañana. Okay, then? Let's